Good evening. My name is Dyer, Assistant Director of Alumni Relations at Baruch College. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Relations, we welcome you to our Baruch in DC series, where alumna Yvette LaGonterie, MPA of 1990, will present on the 1862 District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, Enslaved at the Georgetown Hotel. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself on mute during the program. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A session. I thank you in advance for your cooperation. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Becky Williams, President of the DC chapter, and also alumna from the class of 1988. Becky?
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for the DC area Baruch College Alumni Chapter webinar this evening. It is always a pleasure to see some new and familiar faces online. We've had a wonderful series of webinars and from fellow alum, and this webinar will no doubt keep us engaged and intrigued. We will have breakout rooms after the Q&A session. April 16th is Emancipation Day in the District of Columbia, an annual holiday. This presentation tells the 100-year story of 3 generations enslaved by the Georgetown Hotel's owner and explains the process of emancipation. Learn about the context of urban slavery in the region in the 19th century, including how the enslaver leveraged her human property for financial gain and how the liberated family eventually progressed into DC's burgeoning Black middle class. The presenter, Baruch alumni, Yvette LaGonterie, is retired from a lengthy federal career. I don't know about that lengthy, but okay, lengthy federal career. She looks so young. Career where she held several senior positions in immigration, international affairs, and homeland security. An avid family historian for more than 20 years, she currently serves as Vice President of the DC area Baruch College Alumni Chapter Board and is on the advisory board of MIRR Alliance, which stands for Migrant Immigration Refugee Rights Alliance. So we are in for a treat tonight. And without further ado, Yvette, our speaker for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. So good to see Baruch alumni here tonight. I'm going to go through for about 40 minutes. I'm going to talk, maybe a little less, but what we invite you to ask questions, but you can put them in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we will respond to the questions. So again, the DC Compensated Emancipation Act will have its 160th anniversary in April. And I'm going to tell you the story of one family who was enslaved at an historic site in Georgetown. It was at that time called the Georgetown Hotel, and it's now called the City Tavern. The building is 225 years old. So 3 generations of this one family were enslaved in this building. So this is a 100-year story that will tell you about the process of compensated emancipation through their experience and through the experience of their enslaver. I'm going to pull up the slides. Share. There we go. Now I'm trying to get the slide. There we go. So the family, the families, as you see listed here, are the Clarks, Dyers, and Lang. The Clarks and the Dyers are the family of the enslaved. Those are the surnames that they used. And E.R. Lang is Eleanor Lang, and she was the enslaver. She was a woman, a businesswoman in Georgetown. We'll talk also about the environment that they lived in, what was going on politically, what was the context of their lives as enslaved people in Georgetown in the early years of the nation. and then the petition process for the compensated emancipation, and we'll go into what their lives were like when they were free. So Eleanor Ridgely Lang, the enslaver, she was born in the area of Georgetown from a family, a property-owning family, innkeepers, as was she and her husband, an innkeeper, an oyster seller, and a caterer. Her husband died in 1820, and she continued managing their businesses until in 1834, she had the opportunity to move into this historic building and rename it the Georgetown Hotel. The Georgetown Hotel is still where the City Tavern is, the corner of M Street in Wisconsin. As those of you who live in DC know, that is the busiest intersection in Georgetown. What you see on the slide is just her announcement that she had refurbished it, that the omnibus stopped there and people should come into her hotel in 1835. But when she moved into that hotel, she brought with her enslaved people. Here we see the bill of sale. 1824, she purchased a little girl, 14 years old, says the bill of sale, from her neighbor for $190. Then the following year, she purchased another little girl, Mary Ann. And as the bill of sale said, Mary Ann was intended to be a slave for life. So the first little girl was Mary, and the second little girl's name was Mary Ann, both 14 years old. Now, so these girls were taken from their family and they moved into the residence of Eleanor Lang. And so what was common in slavery, what we call sisters in slavery, are surrogate families. So these two little girls from that point, they lived together and they were like sisters. And as we saw as life passed, they treated each other as sisters. So at the time, in the 1820s and the 1830s, when they moved into this hotel in Georgetown, Georgetown and Washington, D.C. had become the center of the domestic slave trade. Because at that time, the US had outlawed, around 1807 actually, the US had outlawed international trafficking in slaves. So domestic trafficking became the big business. And at the time in the 1820s, the tobacco market, which was the big industry in Maryland and Virginia, and as you know, DC is formed by taking a portion of Maryland and a portion of Virginia to form what became the capital city. So tobacco was the major industry, but tobacco started to decline. First, the soil had been kind of worn out in Virginia and Maryland from using just that one crop. And so it became more expensive to grow and because they weren't able to produce as much. And also the market was declining. There were other areas that were producing, other countries that were producing tobacco, so there was more competition. So the value of that and the value of a plantation system in Maryland and Virginia was declining. But at that same time, it was booming further south, in the deep south, with the cotton market, what they said called cotton is king, with the cotton gin. And so there was a tremendous demand for labor. So DC being right here in the middle with the rivers coming through and a city, a bustling city, became a market where, so throughout the city, there were slave markets, there were slave pens, there were open air auctions of people, there were couples of people walking through the streets, such that it became it's kind of an embarrassment internationally because this was the city of diplomats. The city had been formed and European diplomats were establishing here from other parts of the world too, South America, even Asia. There were diplomats here and they were very critical of this barbarism, as they saw it, that was occurring in the District of Columbia. Because by then, slavery had been outlawed in almost the rest of the world, at least in Europe it had been. In the 1830s, the United Kingdom outlawed slavery in its colonies, and in the 1840s, France ended slavery in its colonies. So although there were independent nations in the Americas that continued slavery, and the United States being one of them, it was certainly, there was a very active abolition movement. So abolitionists were very active in DC, as well as those who were proponents of the continuation of slavery. What you see here is a broadside that was used by abolitionists. But in the same time, their lives were very circumscribed by laws, even free Blacks. And in DC, the population was about 1/3 people of African ancestry. From when DC was first formed, it has always been that way. But they had very strict codes, the Black codes of Georgetown, what you see here, because Georgetown at that time was an independent city in the county of Washington, District of Columbia. Very strict, in every movement of enslaved people and Black people was controlled. And this, just as an example, is showing how it was unlawful for any slave to sit on a bench in the market, and they could be subject to be whipped if their owner would not pay a fine. So this was very common. And so people here, families were being torn apart, people were being sold to the South, and even free Black people were often also picked up. If they didn't have evidence of their freedom, they'd be arrested and put into a pen until evidence was made available. And if evidence wasn't, if they could sell someone, as we saw in the story of 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup, they would be sold to the South, and through trickery. And sometimes they were sold because they were penned and then confined. And if they could not pay the fees for their own confinement, their own unjust confinement, for their failure to pay the fees, they would be sold south. So that was the environment for these girls as they were starting their own families in Georgetown. Now, the Georgetown Hotel, before it was the Georgetown Hotel, it was managed by a man named McCandless. And taverns throughout the United States were places for slave trade, especially in the District of Columbia, where this was a big industry. So here is an example of the McCandless Tavern. And there were many ads like this in the newspapers during the time he managed this, that a slave trader was coming to Georgetown. He was advertising, find him at McCandless Tavern, and he was looking to buy 50 Negroes. So this is very typical of what was going on in taverns. So he died, McCandless, in 1832. And that's when Eleanor Lang came to be the proprietor of the building at the hotel. And so imagine that these girls, and they had started having their own children. So in the 1830s, they were being brought to a place that would have been just down the street from where they were living in the inn that Eleanor was managing. They would have known that this is a place with this type of horrific activity was going on, and it was endangering them too. But actually, after Eleanor purchased the hotel, there's no evidence that it was used for slave trading after that. And she placed an ad, which we see here to the Georgetown Hotel, saying that she had refurbished it. This was an upscale place, and please come to her hotel. So we watch what happens. Eleanor Lang purchased 2 teenage girls. And so in the mid 1820s, so in 1830, we see that there were 3 people enslaved to her in her household, according to the slave scheduled part of the census in 1830. Actually, in 1830, it was not a separate schedule. It was actually in the census form, but enslaved people were not named. In 1830, only a head of household was named, and then there was a count of the other individuals, including the enslaved people. So at this time, she had 2 female slaves and 1 female under 10, which indicates that one of these women had a child. By 1840, there were 7. And so 4 males, 3 females. And in 1850, there were 5 females, 2 males, and 3 under 10. So what we see is Eleanor's investment, $190 for Mary, and then $200 for Mary Ann, was paying off for her, because as they had children, those children were her property, her value. So this was her kind of dividend on the purchase of these 2 girls. By 1860, 3 adult females and 6 children in the household. But it's interesting that 3 adult females, and I'll show you why. Well, 2 years later, after that 1860 census, and again, remember, they were not named in the censuses, and many parts of the US, enslaved people were not attributed a last name in documentation, even when they were named, but we see in DC that they were. So April 16th, 1862, President Lincoln signed the DC Compensated Emancipation Act. And when he was a member of Congress, he had introduced something like this in 1851, but it never got out of committee. There was absolutely no interest in that. But what happened in 1862? The Civil War had started. So the Confederate the Southern delegates, they were no longer in Congress. So Congress now is dominated by Northern delegates who, for the most part, were not favoring slavery. So after many, many years of debate about slavery, including there was at one time a gag rule that was passed by the Southern delegation. They were able to pass this where they couldn't even raise the topic in Congress of emancipation. But that had been overcome by the federal Congress, not by the DC government, because the people in DC were not really cared about that. In 1862, there were only about just over 3,000 enslaved people left in DC. Most of the African Americans were free by that time. And they still were about 30% of the population, and about 80% then of the African Americans living in the District of Columbia were not enslaved. So the Compensated Emancipation Act meant compensation would go to the slave owner for the loss of their unpaid labor, not to the unpaid laborer who had labored for years and perhaps decades, but to the slave owner. So the unpaid labor liberated did not get any compensation. So, but the person who made the petition, that slave owner, had to be loyal to the Union and had to take an oath to that. So there were a few of the DC slave owners who could not pass that test. So in 1862, Congress approved a supplemental act that allowed the remaining enslaved people to file petitions on their own behalf. Now, one thing about this act, it was signed on April 16th, 1862, and it immediately liberated all enslaved people. That was the end of slavery for these people. So the next process was for those enslaved people to try to get some money out of this. And this was to make them, not feel so bad about losing what was once a valuable property for them. So let's talk about the petition process. So here's page 1 with Eleanor Lang's petition for compensation. Here she had to list the names and physical descriptions of all of the people who were enslaved to her. And so this is how I learned the names of these people and some things about them, their ages. And the next page, though, was very helpful because she had to explain how she came to be their owner. And as a result, it tells me that Mary Dyer was purchased from James Essex, and that is the girl that she purchased in 1824. And because of that information, I was able to find the bill of sale. And it even tells how the person that she purchased it from came to have them. A little gives a trail at least. And then it explains that Lizzie Clark and Henry Clark are the children of Marianne Lincoln, who she purchased in 1825. But Marianne Lincoln is not listed here, so she probably died. There's no evidence that Eleanor had sold her, so she probably had died. And then it tells all of the offspring of these individuals and how they are all related. So there are 10 people listed here, from going down to just one boy, Frank Clark, who wasn't even a year old yet. And she here has to describe them, what type of work they do. So Mary Dyer, she said, is a healthy, excellent cook. And then Henry Clark was a house servant. And it also has a little annotation there that says that Henry, an adult male at the time, and George were insured. And we notice I mentioned in the 1860 census that there were no adult males in the household. And often what it means when insurance was taken out for an enslaved person, the slave owner was hiring them out. And perhaps they were engaged in some work that was dangerous. And this way, the enslaved person, if that enslaved person was harmed in some way, was lost a limb or died doing the type of work they were doing, the enslaver still gets paid. So, in hiring out, usually the person hired out, the wages for that person's labor is being paid to the slave owner. In some cases, they would get some money, but in many cases, they were not. So then we learned that she had that insurance, so we know that they were probably being hired out. Then we see an annotation on her petition, that her petition was subject to a lien, because Eleanor was very ambitious. She, in addition to buying that building that was the Georgetown Hotel, she was buying neighboring properties. She was expanding her business. And to do that, she was taking mortgages and using her enslaved people as her collateral. So here we see that her claim for compensation was subject to a lien from the person who had the loan, who she had taken this loan from in 1858. So it's also interesting to see that Eleanor, quite a successful businesswoman, she was illiterate. That's her X on the bottom of the page. So she was a successful businesswoman, but she wasn't literate. And I guess that's just a sign of the times. Just a reminder, any questions, you can put them in the chat. So when I went back also and looked for the records on the loan that she took, I saw that she started taking loans for this family in 1841, when everyone was still a child, that the women she first purchased had just very young children, but that's when she started taking loans out on them. But the thing is that this made their life even more tenuous, because if she failed to pay her debt, they were subject to sale. They could be seized by the creditor and put on auction, which is what this loan agreement says, at a public or private sale at the discretion of the trustee and the proceeds, so that they can at such time and place, making the sale appear the most interest of all concerned. So if Eleanor at any time could not pay her debts, and I saw in doing research many newspaper notices of auction of enslaved people to pay the debts, to pay rent, to pay to creditors, because they did not have the money to pay their debts, and enslaved people were paying the cost by being sold off. So that's the risk that the family was living under at this time. So Eleanor kept, pursuing her money, and here again we see descriptions and her appraisal of them that she had her attorney sign here, Mr. Addison, and submit to a commission that the US government had to stand up for this process. And it was very interesting to me that this was a 90-day process. And I had a long career with the government, and we really could not execute something like this so quickly, where they had to have forms and have a commission to review them, have a process set up. But this was all happening in a 90-day period. So again, we see the physical description and what her appraiser said they were worth. Now, the act said that on average, slave owners would only get $300 a person, and which was much less than the value before the Civil War. But during the Civil War, there really was no place that enslaved people could be sold. So here she's claiming 600, you should see 1,000 for Lizzie Clark, who was a 33-year-old woman, $1,200 for her brother, and so forth. But she did not, of course, get that much money. So the formerly enslaved people, they also had to go to the commission and show themselves and be inspected. The commission said, okay, you actually exist. And remember, they were free now. They were freed from April 16th. But this on June, we see in 1862, they went. Why did they go? Because they needed evidence that they were free people. Because although the Civil War was going on, remember, this is before Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So slavery was ongoing. And even that Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the Confederate states. It did not apply to Maryland, for example, which was still a slave state throughout the Civil War. And the Fugitive Slave Act was still in effect. So if they did not have evidence that they were free, then it was very, very difficult, dangerous for them. Plus, they didn't know what would be the outcome of the Civil War. So they needed to go and appear, and so that they could get that evidence issued to them. Part of the process also was that the enslaved person making the claim had to place a notice in a newspaper. But this is all part of the process so that the names in these individuals were listed, sort of like, you know, like the old-fashioned marriage bans, so that if someone disputed their claim, they could go to the commission and say, no, Eleanor Lang really does not have a claim to this individual for whatever reason. So this was also part of the process. So here we see the final of what happened here. She has her appraisal, the claimant's appraisal, and then we have the government's appraisal, which was different. And it all kind of averaged out. Some were like 175, 373, but it averaged out to around $300 a person. So for these 10 individuals, Eleanor received just over $3,000. So her investment in the mid-1820s for two girls, she paid $190 and $200, was $390. And her return, 30 years later, less than 30 years, was over $3,000. So again, even though this was an emancipation, she still had a good return for the children of the two girls that she purchased. So what happens next with this family? We see their names: Mary, Lizzie for Elizabeth, Henry Clark, George Dyer. George is Mary Dyer's son, and Lizzie and Henry are siblings. And Lizzie had many children: Mary Clark, Eliza Clark, William Clark, Alfred, Maria, and Frank. So now these are free people. And the District of Columbia at the time, they had already had, like as I said, there weren't that many enslaved people left, that 80% of the Black Americans living in the District of Columbia at the time were already free. So they had vibrant communities. They'd set up schools, churches that were founded. There were mutual aid societies. So this is the community in Georgetown that they were now free people to, they were joining this free community, but they were joining it in the middle of the Civil War. And of course, the city was quite different. There were refugees, fugitives from slavery that were flooding into the city. So there were refugee camps all over the District of Columbia and Georgetown. These crosses you see on this map of Georgetown are Civil War hospitals that were throughout the city. Buildings were taken over and turned into hospitals. And of course, they would see the US colored troops that were coming through the city. And of course, they were just military encampments everywhere. And some people ask, well, did they stay with their enslavers? And for what studies have shown, for the most part, the freed people did not stay in the households of their enslavers. It was very rare that they did, because in fact, they were able to get on with their lives, make more money, start businesses, be part of the community, because the city was booming. The city was growing so fast. There were so many opportunities. There were factories, munition plants, many, many other things for them to do. And that's what this family did. They left the Georgetown Hotel and went on with their lives and did well. So in the rest of the 1860s, to talk a little bit, their families started to grow. The young women, the daughters of Elizabeth Clark, they started to marry. In 1864, Lizzie's eldest daughter married a man named Charles Stewart and started a family. And here we see Mary Dyer, who was the matriarch of the family. The other girl that was purchased in the 1820s was no longer living. So Mary Dyer was the matriarch of this family of 10. And her son, George Dyer, was literate. It even said so on the petition that he was a good clerk. So he was a literate member of the household. And he was working as a clerk in a feed store. And it just happens that right down the street from Dumbarton Street on M Street, what we know as M Street now, there was a store owned by an African-American named Alfred Lee. And it was a very large feed store, a very successful business that had been there for a very long time. And so it's possible that he worked there. Here is his draft registration in 1863. There's no evidence that he actually was drafted or served, but he certainly did put his name forward for draft registration. You notice he was living on Dumbarton Street. But in 1869, Mary Dyer, his mother, purchased a home on Dumbarton Street. So 7 years after being enslaved, she purchased a home for $750 at auction on Dumbarton Street. She took out a mortgage. She had insurance on the house, and she was working as a laundress. Now, laundress was a pretty good business at the time. I don't know how she had a business, or whether she had employees, or whether it was just she and Elizabeth doing the work. But in any case, there was a lot of work for that. You notice all of those Civil War hospitals, the encampments. So not just private households needed laundry. The government actually was hiring people to do laundry. So, however, she was able to do this. She was a widow at the time too. Her husband had died a few years before, Alfred Dyer. So I find it, very pleasing that she was able to buy a house so soon. Now, she was pretty savvy, I think. So we see her in the 1870 federal census listed here, 59 years old and keeping house, but she was actually working as a laundress. And that house that she purchased for $750, here it says the value of her real estate is $1,800. And I have no indication that she owned anything other than that house. And it's likely that at the time that was the value of the house. Remember, this city was growing like crazy. There was a big demand for homes and real estate. And this was a pretty nice home. So she had members of the household living there with her. So again, the family begins to grow. So Elizabeth's son, Alfred, he got married in Holy Trinity Church, which is the oldest Catholic church in the District of Columbia. And it's in Georgetown and right across from Georgetown University. And here he married Jenny Cole in the church. And this is, of course, in Latin. And he was not Catholic. He received a dispensation. And he married someone, Jenny, who had never been enslaved, nor had her parents. They were shown in the census and the records as free people for both generations. Here is a photo of Alfred and his wife, Jenny, which is actually Virginia. And they lived on Volter Street, which is a street in Georgetown. It probably didn't not look like that. It was more like an alley at the time that they lived there. And that was one of the many addresses they had. In the 1880s, we start to lose members of the family. Here we see William H. Clark, that he died, and his funeral was at the residence of his aunt. Remember, they had become one family. They weren't, related by blood. They lived as one family. They continued to live together with his aunt, Mary Dyer, the head of the household. They live right nearby the Mount Zion United Methodist Church. And that's one of the oldest, that is the oldest African-American congregation in the District of Columbia, founded in 1808. And so they were members of that church. Also, unfortunately, Mary Dyer's son, George Dyer, he died in 1881. So the family members were starting to depart. And unfortunately, even Mary Dyer, she was on the other side of the city. And where like around D Street, around the area where a lot of the federal buildings are, and she fell. And so a newspaper article tells us that she fell, and she died the next day. But she had a will for her property, and the will spelled out that she left her home on Dumbarton Street to her daughter-in-law, her husband's widow, and to Elizabeth, who in the will, she called her adopted daughter. And that was who was actually the daughter of Mary Ann, who was purchased by Eleanor the year after Mary Dyer was purchased. But Mary Ann died early. So Mary Dyer more or less raised Elizabeth Clark. So she left the majority of her property to her, but also to Elizabeth's children. And that was all spelled out in the will. And so the property had increased in value too. So because she mentioned the former to receive $2,000. Actually, the house is still there and it's worth over $2 million now. So here we see one of Alfred's children. He had with his wife, Virginia, about 9 children, and just a view of what the neighborhood looked like during their lives in 1890s. So again, just some more information about the family moving forward. Eliza was one of Elizabeth Clark's children. She married a man named Sidney Sims, who worked as a copyist for the US government, which meant he was very literate because he had to handwrite documents out because there were no photocopiers and do that kind of work. So she was there with her son and other members of the Clark family in the home on Dumbarton Street. She lost her son in 1911, her only child, and he was buried in Holy Rood Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery. She apparently had also become Catholic. And Alfred Clark lost his wife. And so there were notices in the newspaper. So we know a little bit about her, of course, listing all of her children, but we also know that she was a member of a mutual aid society. So she was active in her community. So 2729 Dumbarton, in 1925, the family sold it. And this is the bill of sale that lays out how they acquired, how they came to own the property through the will of Mary Dyer, spelling it all out. So in 1925, it was sold and the remaining heirs split the proceeds. But unfortunately, just a few months after that sale in April, Alfred Clark passed away. So there were only Alfred and Eliza Clark left of the 10 people who had been enslaved by Eleanor Lang. And then in 1926, Eliza, no longer living in Georgetown, but living with her niece nearer to DuPont Circle, she was hit by a car, 74 years old, near her home, was hit by a car and died from her injuries. But we see that she, who was born enslaved in Georgetown, and was at the time she was liberated when she was about 14 years old, she was not literate, but that she became a very active person in the community, that she was a member of all of these different community organizations and societies and held positions, as an officer in some of them in some cases. So these notices are from these different organizations, the Ladies Christmas Addicts Association, the Eastern Stars, Golden Leaf Whispering, and et cetera, et cetera. So we see that this family, once enslaved, came forward and became part of the community in a great way. So she was the last of the 10 to die from that. So going forward just a little bit, this is a picture of Alfred Clark's descendants, his son Stuart and his wife and some of their children, and a gathering of those Clark family descendants. And some good news I have to share is that in October of last year, that at the George, what's now called the City Tavern, once the Georgetown Hotel, I brought this information to them in 2019. And so they wanted to make this information known, and I gave this talk that I'm giving to you there in February 2020. And then it was decided that Alfred Clark, as the photo that you saw, that he should be acknowledged in the building. So October last year, Alfred Clark's photo was installed in the building. This is the historic site, which is on the National Register of Historic Places, as someone who had been enslaved there. And it's the only image, painting, portrait of anyone who ever resided in that building in its 225-year history. And here's the original jewelry that the photo was copied from. So Alfred and his beloved wife, Virginia, are seen here. So these are the cufflinks that he would have worn with the photos of himself and his wife, and the brooch that his wife wore with the two photos. I'm trying to get to the last slide. It's not moving for some reason all of a sudden. There we go. So I dedicate this to Bobby Clark, who is the grandson of Alfred. And I've known all my life as Uncle Bobby because he is the husband of my mother's first cousin, who is pictured here beside him. Their two daughters they're holding, and Uncle Bobby's mother on the far right. So unfortunately, he passed away in 2020, not too long after I uncovered all of this information, but he did get to hear all about it. So these are some of the sources I used, and here's my contact information if you would like to contact me for any reason, please do. And please, it's now open to questions, and you can add them to the chat, or I guess we'll see how Neftali wants to handle that.
Thank you so much, Yvette. Could you stop sharing
Yes.
really quick? Thank you. This was such a rich conversation. Thank you so much. One of the questions that I actually had, and I think you answered it by your last slide, was why so much of an interest in this? If you want to, add on to what you have already mentioned about your Uncle Bobby, please do.
Well, I'm very interested in African-American history. And when I was an undergraduate, I majored in mass communications and I minored in history, concentrating on African-American history. And just to tell you, my academic advisor at the time told me that was a waste of time. But nevertheless, I continued and still have a great passion for it. So now that I have more free time, I have been pursuing research into stories that intrigue me. And when Uncle Bobby told me that he knew that his family went back for generations in Georgetown, I wanted to find out more about them. And he did not know this story about the enslaved people. And on the date that we installed the photo and commemorated Alfred Clark and his family at the City Tavern, there were about 17 of the descendants of Alfred Clark who came there for the luncheon. And some said they had passed by the building many times and it just never had would have crossed their mind that their own ancestors had once been enslaved there.
Wow, thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question? You don't have to put it in the chat. You can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. Yvette, you did such a wonderful job.
Yeah, I was amazed by it myself. It's just so much intriguing story, and to see that this was a connection to your family. So you kind of left us in suspense toward the end that, this is my family member. What fascinated me was the part where the slaves were a commodity. They were basis for the, it's sort of like if she didn't make due or pay her mortgage, she could use the people. I mean, is that like I never heard of that. I've heard of buying it, I guess, but I never heard of that part where, those people could be auctioned or something to cover her mortgage or something.
Yes.
Wow. And that's, you just don't think of that, but thanks for bringing that out. I mean, that kind of, yes. Okay. And I was just trying to get the history of the whole family members too, the way you broke it down. I wish I was taking more notes because it seemed like you really broke it down there. So that was very helpful. I might have to come and see it again so I can really see all of that. But
please do.
But it was definitely so rich. It really is. It really is very rich history. And for the hotel to recognize it.
Yes, I was very pleased with that result. So I'm also involved now with that City Tavern. They've invited me to be on the board of the City Tavern Preservation Foundation. And in that role, I do bring programming there about the African-American history in the district.
Wow. Did you expect all of this after you?
Oh, no. No, I went there and I expected that, and I offered to give a presentation. So no, I didn't know that it would result in this.
That's how it goes. You don't expect it, but it opens up so many doors for you.
Yeah.
We don't have any questions in the chat, but we do have 2 comments from Nova O, who says there is no question, but wonderful presentation. Thank you. And also from Karen Gutierrez, insightful presentation, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this was at the Georgetown, what you call it, the Georgetown Hotel?
That's what it was called then, but it's now called the City Tavern.
City Tavern. So I'll have to, when I go past that, I'll have to remember that. Do they have some plaque outside or something, or is inside the hotel?
Well, the photo is inside.
Tavern, okay, okay.
Yvette, I have a quick question. I had read somewhere, maybe you can give me some more in-depth information about this, that before the emancipation even passed, many slaves fled to Maryland. Why was that?
They actually were fleeing from Maryland.
Oh.
And they were fleeing, especially after the war started. And there were so many people coming from the Confederate States. But according to the notices that were always published in the newspaper, there were a lot of enslaved people from plantations in Maryland that would flee to the district because it was an urban life, and it was easier to kind of disappear into the population.
That explains it. Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? Okay.
I was fascinated. I was fascinated by that chart you showed where the person, they couldn't sit or stand or in that market. I thought that was interesting that they had I guess some kind of law or whatever. Black Negroes, they called them at that time, could not sit or stand. Remember that chart that you had?
Yes, yeah, that was in part of like a 30-page document of Black codes restricting everything.
Right. So, that's got to be fascinating. So there's a whole bunch of, you're saying there's a bunch of codes there that
yes, that was just one example of what's listed there.
Oh, wow. So that was, anybody could, if you were doing something wrong based on this book of codes, you could be brought up
Yes.
on this, right?
Mhm.
Wow. And was that a DC thing? Was that a DC?
Oh, no, that was that was throughout the US.
Oh.
Yes, less so in the North than in the South, but certainly throughout the South.
Never heard of it. What was it called again? The DC?
The Black codes.
The Black code. Okay, learning something.
In every area where there was slavery, they usually had Black codes.
Okay.
And so the 1862 Emancipation Act also disallowed the Black code. So those were then, that was no longer enforced.
Okay. Good. I definitely learned something there. Thank you. Wow.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, I will actually, it's only not a lot of people on here, but I think it's safe to say we can go out into a breakout room and have some conversations and then come back to say goodbye afterwards.
All right.
Just a second, let me get that going.
Line or something. Yeah.
Thank you all again for going inside your breakout rooms. I do see that some people departed, which is normal for this to happen. But once again, we want to thank Yvette LaGonterie for a great presentation for Baruch and DC speaker series.
Yes.
Thank you, Becky Williams, as the president of the chapter, and also Yvette being the vice president. Do we have some closing remarks from Yvette?
Well, thank you all for attending, and I just mentioned that perhaps we'll send it out to our alumni in the area that I will be giving these remarks again on April 20th at the City Tavern, but that'll be an in-person event, but we'll try to get an announcement out to everyone about that.
Okay. Yes. Okay. That'll be in person. Okay. Perfect. Maybe I'll have enough courage to go. I don't know. I'm still kind of leery about in person, but but that's good. That's good to know. Okay. But I know that's going to be a big one then if you're going to be that's actually the place, City Tavern. Will they have a dinner or something?
Well, no, they may have some wine, you know, a bar open, but the last time when I gave it there in February 2020, we had about 100 attend. But this will be the second time, so we'll see what we get. And last time too, there was an article in the Washingtonian magazine about it, so that also drew people.
Yeah, drew some people. Yeah, so yeah, might be a lot of people there this time. So you're going to give the same similar presentation.
Yeah, so there's some updates because some of the people will have heard what you heard tonight. So there'll be some more detail that will include more about the City Tavern.
Will that be a cost event? I'm sorry, will that be a cost event? Oh, that's free.
No, that will be, I believe it's free. I think it's free.
Okay.
Definitely, Yvette, please be sure to share the information, and we would gladly get it out to our Baruch and DC alumni that are there. And I'm sure many of them would want to be probably ready to be in person for an in-person event soon. And please do stay tuned, as we will be having another event probably in the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, and might possibly be in person. Hoping everything goes, you know, the cases go down with the pandemic. So we will once again be able to see each other in person and have a conversation face to face, where we're able to dialogue with each other face to face. But thank you all this evening, and please be sure to look out for the recording will be sent out to everyone that registered. So thank you again, and we shall see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all too. Sorry I didn't get to hear you, William Henry.
Yes.
And Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Amy.
Bye-bye.
Karen.